I stood in my parents' kitchen, still holding the polished black frame that contained my freshly printed medical school diploma. The paper inside gleamed under the afternoon light, but it felt strangely weightless, hollow even. Across from me, my mother was meticulously arranging pastel-colored cupcakes on a tiered glass stand like she was prepping for a magazine shoot. She didn't even glance up as she said it. Ethan just deserves it more, honey. It took a second for the words to register. Excuse me? She finally looked up, her tone calm, almost soothing. He's always been more focused. You've always had other interests. I felt something twist hard inside me. We graduated together with the same honors, the exact same GPA. She gave me that look, subtle but sharp, the one she always wore when I challenged her narrative. Layla, she said, as if my name itself was an exhale of disappointment. Your brother doesn't have someone like Dr. Monroe championing his future. You've had certain advantages. I almost laughed. Advantages? Working 80-hour weeks in the neuro lab while Ethan spent weekends skiing in Vail with them? Pulling double shifts to pay rent while he crashed in the guest house they funded? The only advantage I ever had was the ability to survive without being noticed. So I'm being punished, I said quietly, for finding my own way. My dad walked in just in time to hear that last sentence. He looped an arm around my mother and joined the conversation like it was a casual chat. No one's punishing you, Layla. We're just being practical. Ethan needs more support. You've always been the resourceful one. That word again, resourceful. The word they used to justify not flying out for my presentations, but somehow managing it for Ethan's conference on sports medicine and strength training. The word they leaned on when he got a brand new car for his birthday and I got a $25 gas card. Resourceful was a euphemism for alone. I swallowed the knot in my throat. Tomorrow's party, it's not just for Ethan, right? We both graduated. My mom was already rinsing strawberries in the sink, her back to me. It's a celebration of Ethan being debt-free. That's what people are coming for. Because of you, because you made it that way. I didn't say it, I didn't have to. I need to head out, I said instead, grabbing my keys and slinging my bag over my shoulder. I got an early shift at the hospital. As I reached the door, my mother's voice followed me like a silk ribbon with thorns. Will you still come to the party, Layla? It wasn't really a question. She didn't want me to ruin the aesthetic of the event by being absent. Of course, I lied, even as something in me recoiled. In the car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine. My phone buzzed in the cup holder and I reached for it absently, expecting another reminder from the hospital scheduler. But it was a name I hadn't seen since our last late-night lab session. Vice Scarlett Monroe, need to speak with you urgently. Big news about the Griffin Fellowship. For a heartbeat, I forgot how to breathe. The Griffin Fellowship? It was the most competitive neurosurgical research position in the country. Only one graduating medical student across the entire U.S. was selected each year. Full loan forgiveness, a housing allowance in Baltimore, and mentorship under some of the most elite minds in medicine. I stared at the message, and slowly, reality began to settle in like snow on a quiet rooftop. They'd paid off Ethan's loans. But I was about to do something even bigger. I hadn't asked him for a single dollar, and now I might be debt-free on my own merit. But I also knew something else, something colder. If this fellowship was mine, if I'd actually won it, my parents wouldn't be proud. They'd be surprised. They'd find a way to say it was luck or timing or Dr. Monroe's favoritism, because they'd already decided the story. Ethan was the golden child, I was the background. And I was about to disrupt that narrative in a very public, very uncomfortable way. The next morning, I arrived at Dr. Monroe's office 10 minutes early, though I'd been awake since 5 a.m. My nerves wouldn't allow sleep. Her assistant waved me in without a word, and I stepped into a room that still made me feel small, even after all these months. Tall bookshelves lined the walls, filled with journals, medical volumes, framed research awards, and photos of her with world-renowned surgeons. It smelled faintly of eucalyptus and ambition. Dr. Monroe stood near the window, reviewing a file in her hands. She turned when she heard me, her eyes as sharp as ever, but her smile was warm. Layla, she said, you're here. I nodded, clutching the strap of my bag like a lifeline. You said it was urgent? She motioned to the chair across from her desk. Sit. I have extraordinary news. I felt my heart leap into my throat. This was it. She paused for a moment, the silence deliberate, letting the weight of the moment settle. The committee made their decision on the Griffin Fellowship, she said, setting the file down, and they've selected you. Time stopped. The hum of the building's air system, the distant sounds from the corridor, everything faded into nothing. I sat frozen. My voice cracked and I had to clear my throat. Are you sure? Dr. Monroe let out a rare laugh. They were unanimous. Your dual medical research into neurovascular regeneration blew them away. Your combination of surgical innovation and pharmacological integration was something no one else even came close to. I could barely breathe. That means loan forgiveness, a generous stipend, guaranteed housing near Johns Hopkins, access to the most advanced neurosurgical labs in the country. It means everything, Layla. She leaned forward slightly. It means they see you. My eyes burned, not with sadness this time, but with something I hadn't felt in so long. Validation. Dr. Monroe wasn't finished. There's one more thing, she said, her tone shifting. Your parents invited me to Ethan's party tonight. I blinked. They did? As a courtesy, I suppose, likely not realizing our connection. Probably not, I murmured, a bitter edge slipping into my voice. She watched me carefully. I'd like to make the announcement there. I stiffened. At the party? Yes, she said plainly, in front of everyone. I looked down at my hands. No, it's supposed to be Ethan's night. And they'll think I'm trying to upstage him. She tilted her head. Layla, I've observed your family for 2 years now. The way they speak to you, about you, this is not about upstaging. It's about being seen, recognized publicly, because some people only acknowledge what's placed right in front of them. She wasn't wrong. If I told my parents quietly, they'd downplay it, pretend it was nothing. Something like this, they couldn't ignore. Still, my gut twisted. I'm not sure how Ethan would feel. I understand, she said gently, but this is your achievement, and it deserves space. I looked up and nodded slowly. Okay, do it. As I stepped out of her office, my phone buzzed again, a message from Ethan. Mom's going way overboard for tonight. It's honestly embarrassing. I wish she put this much energy into celebrating both of us. See you there. I stopped walking. It was the first time Ethan had ever acknowledged the imbalance, ever. Before I could even respond, another message came through, this time from Mom. Don't forget to dress business casual tonight. And please, let Ethan have his moment. This is very important to him. The contrast between the two messages was sharp, one uncertain and real, the other polished and performative. Maybe I'd misjudged Ethan all these years, or maybe we'd both been trapped in a script someone else had written. But tonight, I wasn't just showing up for another round of quiet resentment. I was walking into that rooftop party with a secret they didn't see coming, and I was finally ready to take up space. The elevator chimed softly as it opened to the rooftop terrace. The moment I stepped out, the sheer scale of the celebration hit me. Fairy lights wrapped around every column, a jazz trio played near the far edge of the deck, and a white banner stretched across the skyline. Congratulations, Dr. Ethan. There were champagne towers, silver-draped tables, and a towering cake with surgical instruments made of fondant. It looked more like a wedding than a graduation party. I adjusted the hem of my navy full dress and forced myself to keep walking, each step echoing louder than the last in my mind. This was Ethan's night, or so I had been told. He spotted me before I reached the main cluster of guests. Layla, he called out, his voice cutting through the music. He weaved through a group of laughing relatives and reached me with a smile that didn't feel rehearsed. Thank God you're here. Aunt Meg has already asked me 3 times when I'm getting married. I gave a tired laugh. Tell her you're married to your pager. Tempting, he looked around, shaking his head. This is nuts, right? Like, Mom and Dad went all out. I raised an eyebrow. You're just now realizing that? He rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly looking sheepish. I mean, I knew they'd do something, but this, it's a lot. Yeah, I said, my voice soft but weighted. It's always been a lot. Ethan hesitated, then said quietly, I tried to tell them it was unfair, that you should be celebrated too, but you know how they are. Once they decide something. I stared at him, trying to process that. You actually said that? He met my eyes. Of course I did. You think I don't notice? Before I could respond, our mom appeared like a well-dressed storm cloud, holding a flute of champagne in one hand and a firm agenda in the other. Ethan, sweetheart, she beamed, sliding an arm through his. The Andersons just arrived. You remember Thomas, right? Chief of surgery at Northwestern? Without waiting for a reply, she began steering Ethan toward the center of the terrace, but not before tossing a glance over her shoulder at me. Layla, could you check with the caterers? Your cousin Beth is being difficult about the gluten-free options again. And just like that, I was back in my place. Invisible assistant, useful but not essential. I made my way to the far side of the terrace, jaw clenched. I was halfway through coordinating with the waitstaff, because of course I did it, when I saw her, Dr. Monroe. She stood at the edge of the crowd, dressed in a crimson pantsuit that commanded the room effortlessly. Her silver hair was pulled back, and she moved like someone who knew exactly where she belonged. She spotted me instantly. Layla, she said warmly, pulling me into a light embrace. Are you ready? I hesitated. I don't know, this whole thing, it's worse than I expected. Her gaze swept across the space. The banner. The slideshow looping on a nearby screen. Ethan's childhood photos, sports victories, snapshots from medical school. I caught glimpses of myself here and there, often blurry or cropped, always background noise. More complicated than I realized, she said quietly. Before I could respond, I saw my parents across the terrace. They were speaking to a tall woman in a navy suit, someone I recognized from my residency interviews. Dr. Naomi Bennett, chair of neurosurgery at Chicago General, and she was smiling at Ethan. My stomach dropped. They're introducing him to Dr. Bennett, I whispered. She runs one of the top neurosurgical programs in the Midwest. We both applied there. Dr. Monroe followed my line of sight. Interesting, she said, but her tone had cooled several degrees. And then my father spotted us. He approached with practiced charm, my mother and Ethan trailing behind. Ro Monroe, he greeted her with a polite nod. It's such an honor to have you here tonight. I understand you've worked with Layla? Dr. Monroe raised an eyebrow. Worked with her. Layla's been my lead research partner for the past 2 years. Her contributions were crucial to the success of our brain trauma studies. My parents blinked, just slightly off balance. My mother recovered first. Well, that's lovely. Ethan's been involved in neurosurgical research as well. In fact, Dr. Bennett was just telling us how impressed she is with his application. I nearly choked. Ethan wasn't even applying to neurosurgery. His focus was sports medicine and orthopedics. They were actively misrepresenting his experience, using my accomplishments to build his reputation. Dr. Monroe remained calm, but I saw it, the hard edge behind her smile. That's surprising, she said smoothly. I was under the impression Ethan's concentration was orthopedic, not neurosurgical intervention. Perhaps I misunderstood. An awkward silence followed, brief but suffocating. I felt a storm building in my chest, rage, betrayal, and something colder, recognition. They didn't just overlook me, they were trying to erase me. And I was done letting them. Dinner was underway when I finally sat down. At a table tucked near the edge of the terrace with cousins and extended family friends. My parents were at the head table, flanked by Ethan, our grandparents, and Dr. Bennett. I wasn't surprised. They had always been subtle with the seating chart, just subtle enough to justify later if questioned. We just wanted to keep it balanced, honey. From where I sat, I could hear my father's voice carry across the rooftop, even over the clink of silverware and soft jazz. We always knew Ethan was destined for something remarkable, he was saying to Dr. Bennett, his voice tinged with theatrical pride. Even as a child, he had that spark, that hunger. He laughed. Always our ambitious one. Each word landed like a slow drip of acid in my gut. I pushed food around my plate, appetite long gone. Every so often, Dr. Monroe, seated nearby with other faculty, glanced over at me. Her eyes were calm, but I knew her well enough by now. There was heat behind that calm, the slow build of a wave preparing to break. When dessert was served, a 3-tiered lemon cake topped with gold leaf accents and Ethan's initials in dark chocolate. My father rose and tapped his glass with his fork. The gentle ring cut through the air like a blade. Conversations faded, heads turned. I braced myself. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," he began. "It's been an incredible journey watching Ethan grow into the physician he is today. Medical school is a grueling road, and to come through it not just with excellence but debt-free, that's something truly extraordinary." A round of polite applause followed. My mother stood, placing a hand gently on Ethan's shoulder. "We've always believed in investing in our children's future," she said with a soft smile. "And with Ethan, we knew early on that our support would help him go even further. We couldn't be prouder." That was it. That was the moment. The room heard. Ethan was worthy of support. Layla wasn't. My breath caught, but I didn't move. I wasn't going to cry. Not tonight. I was still now. And then, before I could think, before anyone could pivot the spotlight, Ethan stood. "I'd like to say something," he said, surprising everyone. He turned toward me, his face unreadable, then back to the crowd. "This celebration feels incomplete," he said. "Layla and I graduated together. We had the same GPA, the same classes, the same sleepless nights, and if anything," he paused, "she worked harder because she did it without the same safety net I had." A hush swept over the terrace. My parents looked like statues, mouths slightly open, unsure if this was a joke or a detour they hadn't rehearsed for. "Ethan," my mother said under her breath, "this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," he replied, voice calm, steady. "I can't accept this praise if it comes at the expense of someone who's more than earned it." A few people shifted in their chairs. Whispers spread. I stared at Ethan, unsure what to feel. Gratitude? Shock? Anger for not saying this years ago? And then Dr. Monroe rose from her seat. "If I may," she said, her voice slicing cleanly through the murmurs, "I believe this is an opportune moment to share some news that many of you might not yet know." All heads turned toward her. She smiled, not wide, but sure. Layla has been awarded the Griffin Fellowship at Johns Hopkins. For those unfamiliar, it is the most competitive and prestigious neurosurgical research fellowship offered to a graduating medical student in the United States. Gasps, audible ones. I saw Dr. Bennett straighten in her seat. I saw my cousin's jaws fall open. Even my grandparents leaned in closer. "It includes complete loan forgiveness," Dr. Monroe continued, "a housing stipend, and direct mentorship under a world-class surgical team." The selection committee was unanimous in choosing Layla. They were particularly impressed by her dual-method research into neurovascular regeneration, work she conducted while balancing a full clinical rotation load. The terrace erupted in applause. Real applause. I heard it, felt it, not polite, not forced. For once, it was mine. I looked around as people smiled, clapped, even stood. Professors approached me, nodding in respect. Colleagues congratulated me. A few faculty I didn't even know personally were talking to each other with that excited, reverent tone, reserved for breakthroughs and talent. And then I looked at my parents. They sat still, as if the ground had been pulled from beneath them. My mother blinked rapidly. My father wore a smile too stiff to be real, his mind clearly racing for a way to spin this. Dr. Monroe wasn't done. "Additionally," she added, "I'm pleased to announce that our department has voted unanimously to cover the remainder of Layla's educational loans through our merit-based research fund. Her contributions to our program have been nothing short of exceptional." The applause renewed, louder this time. I was debt-free, but more than that, I had been seen. I had built this moment with every sleepless night, every overlooked win, every lonely mile I walked on my own. And now no one could look away. The applause eventually faded, but the shift in the room was irreversible. I wasn't just part of the background anymore. People were looking at me differently, really looking. My table was no longer the forgotten corner. Now it was the gravity center. Professors, residents, and even Dr. Bennett had turned their attention toward me. Some nodded in quiet admiration. Others approached to shake my hand, asking about my research, my plans for Baltimore, if I'd consider speaking at an upcoming symposium. And through it all, my parents sat, frozen. They weren't clapping, they weren't smiling, they were stunned. caught in a reality they hadn't scripted. Ethan returned to his seat beside them, but he kept glancing in my direction, a soft half smile on his lips. Not smug, not pitiful, just Jessica. No, Layla, I reminded myself. I was Layla, the one who had been overlooked, undervalued, quietly doing everything right while constantly being told I was just fine on my own. Not anymore. The music picked back up, the servers began clearing plates, and slowly, the event resumed its rhythm. Except now, the center had shifted. My parents took their time crossing the floor toward me. I knew the walk probably felt longer than it ever had. Guests stopped them, congratulated them on me, on my fellowship, my success. By the time they reached me, their expressions were carefully arranged. Smiles pulled tight, pride forced through teeth that had gritted too long in silence. Layla, my father began, his voice overly measured. That was quite an announcement. Why didn't you tell us, my mother added, her tone trying to land somewhere between wounded and warm, but there was a tremor beneath it, a tension she couldn't mask. I met their eyes. For once, I didn't flinch. Would it have made a difference? I asked softly. They didn't respond right away. My mother's lips parted, then closed again. My father glanced down. We've always supported you, he said after a moment, just differently. Because we knew you could handle things on your own, my mother added quickly. You never needed as much. That's convenient, I said. My voice wasn't angry, just tired. But it doesn't explain why you flew across the country for Ethan's events but never showed up for mine. Why you paid for his MCAT prep course and not mine. Why you covered his rent through med school while I worked overnight shifts to stay afloat. We only have so much money, my father said, a little sharper than before. We had to make choices. Yes, I nodded, and you consistently chose him? My mother's eyes welled with tears. That's not fair, Layla. We love you both, equally. Maybe you do, I said, voice steady, but you haven't treated us equally. And now you don't get to act like none of that happened. Before they could say more, Dr. Monroe appeared beside me, her presence like a shield I hadn't asked for but desperately needed. Layla, she said gently, Dean Wallace would like a word with you. He wants to feature your story in the alumni journal. She turned to my parents with a smile, polite but firm. You must be proud. It must feel especially rewarding to see Layla's accomplishments recognized publicly, considering everything she's had to overcome. That word again, overcome. Not endure, not survive, but overcome. The emphasis was subtle but unmistakable, a quiet indictment of every moment they'd minimized me. My parents didn't argue, they just nodded stiffly and stepped aside. Later that night, long after the applause, long after the guests had filtered out and the terrace lights dimmed, I returned home to find a small box on my coffee table. No note, just a plain white card that read, "From Mom and Dad." Inside was a rose gold watch, the exact same model they'd given Ethan for his birthday 6 months earlier. I stared at it for a long time. It was beautiful, sleek, expensive. Too late. The next morning, they showed up at my door. My mother held a gift bag. My father looked freshly shaved, like appearances might still fix things. We wanted to do something special for both of you, he said. You're starting your careers now. We thought this was overdue. It's lovely, I said, not reaching for it. My mother shifted awkwardly. We know you probably feel overlooked sometimes, but everything we did because we believed in you. You didn't need as much help. Ethan needed more support. I looked at them, really looked. Two people who had convinced themselves that love and fairness didn't need to look the same, that the child who could swim should be thrown into deeper water while the other was given a boat and oars. That's a comforting story, I said, but it's not the truth. My father sighed. We did our best. No, I said, you did your best for Ethan, for me. You just... The room fell silent. Then my phone rang. Judesh Monroe again, calling to confirm logistics for my move to Baltimore. I answered without hesitation. Yes, I'm available, I said into the phone, walking away from their stunned silence. In fact, your timing is perfect. 3 weeks later, my apartment was reduced to cardboard boxes and echoing floors. The last of my books were packed, the walls bare except for faint outlines where pictures once hung. It was strange how quickly a space could become unfamiliar once your life was removed from it. Ethan sat on the windowsill, sipping iced coffee, watching me seal a final box with packing tape. "I still can't believe you're really leaving," he said, his voice low. "I can," I replied, offering a small smile. "Baltimore feels like the beginning of something real." He nodded. "It's just weird. We've always been side by side, high school, college, med school. Now it's like we're actually becoming separate people." "Probably overdue," I said. We both laughed softly. There was a pause, and then his expression shifted. "I keep thinking about what Mom and Dad did, or I guess..." I sat beside him on the sill, looking out at the skyline. "You don't have to carry that," I said. "It wasn't your fault." "I benefited from it," he said. "I thought I was the lucky one, that their attention was some kind of reward, but looking back, it held me back too, made me dependent on their approval. I didn't even know how much of myself I was performing until I saw you just being..." I looked at him, surprised. "You didn't do anything wrong, Ethan." "I didn't do enough right either," he said quietly. "I should have spoken up sooner." I placed a hand on his arm. "You did, when it mattered." He nodded, swallowing hard. "They're devastated, you know. Mom's been crying, Dad's out there telling everyone you're his brilliant daughter at Johns Hopkins, like he handpicked you for the fellowship." I smiled faintly. "Let him. Doesn't change the facts." And it was true. For the first time in years, their validation, or lack of it, felt irrelevant. I wasn't chasing their approval anymore. I had outgrown it. Fox Monroe had given me more than a fellowship. She'd given me a model of what real mentorship looked like. Challenge, encouragement, recognition, without conditions. "So," Ethan said, nudging me gently, "what happens now, between us?" I turned to him. "Now we figure out who we are without the roles they gave us. Not the golden boy, not the invisible one, just siblings." "I like that," he said, squeezing my hand. We sat there for a moment longer, quiet. No noise, no drama, just peace. Then a knock at the door, the movers. Ethan helped me carry the first box down to the truck, and I paused before stepping in. I looked up at the building, the place I'd spent so many nights studying, dreaming, doubting. A chapter was closing, and I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. This path was mine now. No one else's narrative. No one else's spotlight. Only mine's. And I was finally ready to walk it